With us today is Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Viktorovich Lavrov. If you allow me, I'll give you the floor. Esteemed co-chairs, ladies and gentlemen, friends. I am very pleased to once again receive an invitation to speak from this podium, which has been held for the third year at the initiative of the President of Belarus. The conference has become a leading international platform for discussing key security issues in the Eurasian space, as my friend and colleague Peter Saharda just mentioned. And the fact that Eurasia today is the geopolitical center of the emerging multipolar world is, I think, obvious to everyone. The processes unfolding here are having a decisive impact on the prospects for international relations. I am referring, first and foremost, to the strengthening of several independent civilizational centers on the Eurasian continent. Centers that represent the global majority. And as President Putin has repeatedly noted in his speeches, it is they who set the tone in global affairs today. They set the tone and thereby accelerate the world's liberation from the vestiges of the past, primarily in the areas of security and economic development. We see that the overwhelming majority of NATO and EU countries refuse to acknowledge the objective fact that Western dominance has ended and a new historical era has dawned. This is their fundamental difference from Russia, our CIS partners, China, India, Iran, North Korea, and all those Eurasian states that are convinced that the key to our continent's stability and prosperity lies in strict adherence to the principle of sovereign equality and the indivisibility of security for all, not just a select few who consider themselves above the law and above morality. It is not Russia's or our allies' fault that international arms control agreements have been undermined and then buried in recent years. NATO expansion continues unabated, despite assurances given to Soviet leaders not to advance even an inch eastward. Moreover, this is being done in defiance of the highest-level commitments made within the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe not to strengthen its own security at the expense of others and not to seek regional, or indeed global, dominance. The planned and provoked conflict in Ukraine has led to the final collapse of the Euro-Atlantic security model, which relied on NATO, the OSCE, and, for the last 8 years, the European Union, which has probably become the Euro-Atlantic component of this nexus. Now, some in Europe are suggesting the need to consider a new European security system. But they immediately add that such a system should not include Belarus and Russia. Just think of French President Macron's initiative for a so-called European political community, which they deliberately and publicly refused to invite Russia and Belarus to, thereby creating something akin to a European part of the OSCE, minus 2 countries that are resented in the West and whose policies are resented. Alexander Lukashenko spoke about this in great detail and convincingly today. And it's clear that they are not hiding the preparations they are making against the Union state of Russia and Belarus, the preparations for a new major European war, and are building a coalition to this end. In July, for example, France and Britain agreed to coordinate their nuclear forces, creating a kind of entente for the development of missile systems. The Germans signed an agreement with the British, essentially on military cooperation. And now, just the other day, voices have begun to be heard from London calling for this Anglo-German military cooperation to be extended to a nuclear dimension. The militarization of European countries is gaining momentum, Funding for the military-industrial complex is increasing, large-scale exercises are being conducted, and logistics for the transfer of troops to the Eastern Front are being improved, including using the infrastructure of countries that are not members of the North Atlantic Alliance. And plans to intensify NATO activities in the Arctic cannot but raise concern. We, and I am convinced that most sensible countries, want to see this as an area of peace and cooperation. This is precisely what was once agreed upon within the Arctic Council. But since then, the West has been trying to isolate Russia from this structure. In Ukraine, it is the European members of NATO that are prolonging the armed conflict, pumping the Kyiv regime with weapons and providing it with financial and political support. The leaders of most European countries are doing everything they can to persuade the US administration to abandon the idea of resolving the conflict in Ukraine by addressing the root causes of the conflict at the negotiating table. However, we still hope that President Trump remains sincerely committed to resolving the Ukrainian crisis and will remain committed to the principles developed at the Anchorage summit, which were based on American proposals. In Europe, Russia is being indiscriminately accused of planning an invasion of NATO and EU countries. European leaders themselves concocted this nonsense and are repeating it, deliberately deceiving their own peoples and whipping up anti-Russian hysteria based on the saying, "War will erase everything," as we say. They are trying to shift responsibility for their own mistakes, including the countless mistakes and failures in Ukraine, onto Moscow. I'd like to ask, do Europeans feel safer when their elites unsheath the hatchet? I think the answer is obvious. Incidentally, we have repeatedly stated that we have no intention of attacking any current NATO or EU member state. We are prepared to enshrine this position in future security guarantees for this part of Eurasia. But EU leaders avoid considering these future guarantees on a collective basis, proudly declaring that, after the Ukrainian crisis, there should be security guarantees not with Russia, but against Russia. This is a pattern of thinking. It is also troubling that NATO is artificially expanding its zone of responsibility far beyond the Euro-Atlantic. To this end, the thesis of the indivisibility of Euro-Atlantic security and the so-called Indo-Pacific region has been advanced. When we ask how this relates to the Washington Treaty establishing NATO, we are told that the organization remains a purely defensive alliance and exists to repel threats to the territories of member states. But these threats are now emanating from everywhere, even from the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. NATO is seeking to stake out a position for itself in the Pacific, undermining the very foundations of the regional security architecture, which for decades has been built around the central role of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. This is being done with the obvious goal of containing China, isolating Russia, and confronting the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. NATO is also paying attention to other regions of Eurasia, the Middle East, the South Caucasus, Central Asia, and South Asia. Moreover, these subregions are being addressed individually, rather than in the context of concerns about pan-continental, pan-Eurasian interests. Everywhere, efforts are being made to gain a foothold and influence these processes, and due to the alliance's aggressive policies, this influence is, in most cases, extremely negative. A reasonable question arises. If this is the general trend, do we want our entire vast and beautiful continent to be turned into a NATO base? We cannot agree with this. In the new conditions, where all countries, their economies, and their overall stability are interdependent, what is needed is not the bloc-based thinking of the Cold War era, but a fundamentally different philosophy of interstate interaction. Life itself is pushing us to reorganize our geographic space in the spirit of multipolarity and multilateralism. Russia has taken the first steps. Back in 2015, President Putin, at the Russia-OSCE summit, proposed developing a greater Eurasian partnership, which envisions the creation of a pan-continental framework of equal and mutually beneficial cooperation through the expansion of trade and economic ties and the harmonization of integration processes, including those unfolding within the CIS, SCO, EUES, the Union of Southern States, and, of course, within the OSCE, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and other structures. A little over a year ago, the Russian president put forward another initiative, building a Eurasian security architecture based on the principle of its indivisibility. We see this as a constructive alternative to the bankrupt institutions that served the Euro-Atlantic model. And in that model, colleagues from across the Atlantic always played an overly significant role. We are not, and have no intention of, mandating who should cooperate with whom, but we are posing the question differently. Why not consider creating a pan-continental architecture open to all Eurasian countries and associations? There are many sub-regional military political integration associations here, just as there are in Africa and Latin America. But in Africa and Latin America, in addition to these sub-regional organizations, there are pan-continental forums, such as the African Union and the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. In Eurasia, there is no umbrella association that would provide even a forum for a frank, equal exchange of opinions. I think it is very important that the initiative of the President of Belarus is moving in precisely this direction. And I believe this is a very promising undertaking. I am confident that it has a bright future. True collective security, of course, cannot be limited to serving the interests of a select few. This has already been discussed. This security will either be universal, or it will not exist at all, and everyone will be on their own. Russia advocates for each state to be recognized as having the equal right to choose their own security methods, from military political neutrality to participation in alliances. But this right of choice cannot be exercised in isolation from another, no less important rule. The President of Belarus also spoke about this today. No one can strengthen their security at the expense of others. No country, group of countries, or organization should aspire to regional dominance. Unfortunately, NATO is doing exactly that. While promoting the basic tenets of Eurasian security in multilateral forums, Russia seeks to implement them in practice through bilateral agreements. Recent examples include our security guarantee agreements with Belarus, and our comprehensive strategic partnership agreements with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Another key area is encouraging interaction between various associations on our shared continent. In this work, we attach particular importance to the Collective Security Treaty Organization and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which have accumulated extensive experience in ensuring military political stability and countering new challenges and threats, as we have seen in this regard. The Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, has significant potential, strengthening ties with both the CSTO and the SCO. Recently, at the suggestion of the President of Kazakhstan, it was decided to create a new unifying format, CIS+. We also support Kazakhstan's initiative to transform the Conference on Interaction and Confidence-Building Measures in Asia into a fully fledged organization, specifically one with pan-Eurasian scope. Security in Eurasia is a central topic in our dialogue with the People's Republic of China. We rely primarily on the fact that Russia's vision of the future architecture and security in Eurasia harmonizes with the global security initiative of the Chairman of the People's Republic of China, which enshrines the need for a permanent principle of identifying and eliminating the root causes of any conflict. It is important that this principle be applied in practice, including in Ukraine and the Palestinian territories. Among the specific challenges facing the Eurasian continent, we pay particular attention to preventing violent scenarios on the Korean Peninsula, promoting the stabilization of the situation in Afghanistan and along its borders, ensuring a fair resolution of the Palestinian issue, and normalizing relations between Iran and the Arab world, which is the goal of our well-known Russian initiative to establish a collective security system. In the Persian Gulf region, we firmly support maintaining the central role of the Axis in unifying the efforts of Southeast Asian countries and their partners from various regions based on principles of equality and openness. Axis-centric structures have accumulated substantial experience in collective efforts to counter common challenges and threats. We are convinced that deepening partnerships in such formats, Axis-centric formats, will certainly contribute to the formation of an inseparable space of equal and indivisible security. We believe that deepening cooperation between the Axis, the SCO, the CIS, and the CSTO is a promising area. The Belarusian initiative to develop Eurasian diversity arts is called upon to play a collective, consolidating role. This is a sign of multipolarity in the 21st century. I have already mentioned this. Alexander Grigorievich Lukashenko has reiterated his initiatives in detail and the need to move toward the practical implementation of principles that, by and large, are shared by many countries. We support this promising idea and are actively involved in its promotion. We are ready for substantive discussions to consider all constructive initiatives and proposals for further strengthening Eurasianism while maximizing the comparative advantages of our continent, which are enormous. These comparative advantages must be utilized, of course, for the benefit of all states on the continent. This also applies to Europeans. They are our neighbors. They also live in Eurasia, and I am pleased to welcome the participation of representatives of European countries, the European Union, NATO, and others in today's conference. Another issue is that the current elites of the European Union and NATO have adopted a course of isolating anyone who wants to pursue an independent policy, a policy based on national interests and common sense. As a result, to be honest, there are no prospects for a meaningful dialogue with most of these elites in Europe. The Brussels bureaucracy must abandon its arrogant claims to exclusivity and its hostile course toward many other Eurasian states, including Russia and Belarus. I do not rule out the possibility that in the future it will be necessary to consider a new model of relations in Europe, in the area of security, but as part of a pan-Eurasian architecture. And in conclusion, I would like to emphasize that we view the formation of equal and indivisible Eurasian security as an objective historical process that facilitates the sovereign development of the participating countries. Agreeing on universally accepted security guarantees, including against external threats emanating from outside the Eurasian continent, will make our common space free of conflict and conducive to mutually beneficial and productive cooperation. I welcome the fact that the Minsk Forum has already become an established annual event. I wish us all success. Thank you very much, Sergey Viktorovich, for your speech. We hope that the Minsk Forum will become a good tradition, and we look forward to seeing you next year. Yeah.